We would love to welcome you to this morning's UUCD Forums. This morning is for March's Woven Basket, focusing on CHUM and getting through the pandemic with Lee Stuart, Executive Director of CHUM. CHUM has had extraordinary support from all sectors to help them respond to COVID. However, they still need 30,000 pounds of food a month from the food shelf. And we're going to hear all about their COVID response. And I just wanted to also uplift the leadership that Lee has provided as Executive Director of CHUM since 2013. As a CHUM's leader for many years, Lee, with the assistance of her staff, has been able to grow up to 30 persons and been instrumental in the development of CHUM's services and programs over the past 7 years. So with that, Lee, we are so honored that you are making time. Oh, 8 now. Yeah, I know we're in 2021. Thank you so much for making time, and I'm going to make sure that you're unmuted, and the floor is yours for the rest of this morning. We can't wait to hear what CHUM's been up to.
Well, great. I so love coming to the UU Forums. I think it's one of the most fun things that I do. And so thank you very, very much for having me here. I will share my screen and with some slides, but mostly I like talking. I don't usually bring slides when I come because I like seeing your eyes, but it's very difficult to see eyes in Zoom. And so I always start out with CHUM's mission statement whenever I do anything, and that is people of faith working together to provide basic necessities, foster stable lives, and organize for a just and compassionate community. And so just like everywhere and everyone, we have to figure out how to do our normal operations, take advantage of emerging opportunities in all of those areas of work that we do and in advocacy, and do that in the context of a global pandemic. And so I'm really excited to share. I think we hit it out of the park, and we could not have done any of it without the support of all of our member congregations like you and your incredible generosity and the reputation you have helped us build at the local, county, and state levels. That's super, super important. And then to just want to acknowledge the financial support from congregations, the spiritual support from congregations. And to me, almost the most important part has been this sense of absolute solidarity from our member congregations for the people who come to CHUM. And so there hasn't been a moment that I have felt that we have had anything lacking. But as for normal operations, and I really would love to see this, maybe my problem is that I have too many other things open, but our normal operations for our shelter, we saw 1,146 people came to CHUM shelter during 2020. That's a little bit higher than normal over the last 8 years, but not much. It's within the range of variability year on year. So we did not see a huge influx of people becoming homeless in the pandemic year. Just like normal, about 70% of them were men. Just like normal, nobody had any money. And just like normal, about 50% were from communities of color. So huge overrepresentation of Indigenous and African heritage people among the homeless population because of, as you all know, the historic connection between poverty and race and historical and current trauma that's connected with all of that. This year, about a little under 20% of the people who came had been discharged from some kind of institution within the year. That's a little lower than normal, and part of that was because institutions were doing a different thing about discharging people to homelessness. They were somewhat restricted about that. And only 13% came from a jail or an institution the night before they got to CHUM. That's way lower than normal. And what's happening in it's not good news. What's happening is that people know that I get so upset with them, and we get so upset with them when people are sent down here from a prison or so they just make them homeless, and then people have to get there on their own. So I look at that, but it's kind of creepy, I would say. And then also not normal. Also normal is that over 60% of the people who come to CHUM have a disability of long duration. For the most part, that has to do with their mental health and or chemical health, meaning that homelessness is just one of many suites of things that are affecting people, and simply fixing the housing part of it is not as can't last without the kind of support. So instead of being an emergency shelter where people, the idea of that, where people come for a couple of nights, or a month even, before they get on their feet and get into housing, that's not what's going on at CHUM now and hasn't been for some time. What we are now is pretty much a long-term housing option for people who have multiple disabilities in an environment where there is no available housing for them. And so a tremendous increase in loss of hope. And this was seen last year, only 11%, of people who came to CHUM were experiencing homelessness for the first time. That means that all the rest were either long-term homeless or repeaters or going around and around. And every time you go around that, it gets less and less, it's harder to dig out and the hope dies. Unfortunately, this is a weird thing, and I can share it with you. HUD really will give us tremendous points this year because they will call this reducing homelessness by having fewer first-time people experiencing homelessness. I can't get to a good news about this because what it really means is we have entrenched long-term homelessness and recurrent homelessness. And I'm not sure that's a good trade-off because often for people who are experiencing homelessness for the first time, there's an easier path back to housing, but there isn't here. So the new and improved normal we hope is new and improved normal for the shelter is that we had for the first time sustainable public and private funding for the warming center. So we've been able to keep it open from November till now. Every night we raise the threshold to 32 degrees. So kind of what the rest of the country thinks as cold, we now can say is cold also. And there have been between 30 and 60 people who use either the HRA's Rainbow Center for a warming center or come into CHUM as a warming center. So that looks to me like and this is ongoing funding now from the public sector through a county and state program to CHUM so that we don't have to worry about it every year. And HRA is working with a CDBG CARES grant to remodel the lower part of their Lincoln Park Towers Community Center to put in showers and lockers and bathrooms to make that the permanent warming center for the city of Duluth. So, cheers to all of that as a hopeful new normal. The other new normal we have at the shelter is that we started serving hot meals. It's one of the things that came out of COVID was that we were, when the state funding came, we were allowed to ask for shelter expansion. So I called them and asked them if shelter expansion included food, and they said yes. And so I called up Tom Hansen to see if he could give us a half-price deal at the Duluth Grill and create menus for CHUM. And so since May, we've been having 3 meals a day from the Duluth Inn at CHUM for between 75 and 90 people. That's been a huge economic stimulus to them. It's been a huge nutritional stimulus to us. And between May and December, we served 54,900 meals. And now we're doing 90 a day each meal. So, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that was one of the bright spots of COVID. So at the food shelf, there's never a normal at the food shelf because those of you who know Scott Van Dale knows that he never, ever, ever, ever seems to stop. And so in 2020, the food, you all get the CHUM congregations. Does anyone want to take a guess? Put it in the chat how many tons of food you think you donated. No one is writing anything in the chat. No, I'm not talking, that's probably you at the UUs. This is citywide. 20 tons, 21 tons. 403,849 pounds of donated food. Can you believe that? I mean, we used to think that having 150,000 was a lot. Now we have over 400,000. It's interesting that we're not actually getting more people coming. And that's because of just kind of get people getting to us is difficult, but we are able to provide about 50 to 60 pounds of food now in each food package. During COVID, we went 10 years backwards in food shelf technology, if you will, and started doing prepackaged food so we wouldn't have to have contact and would limit exposure. But that's been huge. And then the emerging new normal here that I want you to know about is partly out of COVID funding and realizing what was happening. We did a feasibility study about what would it take to add delivery to our services at the food shelf. And so we are going to launch that in the next month or so to 120 families, focusing on families who can't get to us because they have the combination of food insecurity and no transportation. We asked Essentia to make a quick study of what that would be, and they said in the last 3 months they had 348 patients who had that combination. So we know that even with 120, we're not touching the need, but we are going to add that to help people who haven't been able to get to CHUM get to what they need. It'll be a 20% increase in what we do. And then more recently, I love this one, the Communities Agriculture Guild approached us through Gloria Day about how to have CSA shares be part of what happens at CHUM. And so there's a campaign launch, an agreement to provide 8 farms to provide 38 shares. And these are not donations, but these will, this is an added type of service that we have to provide, super fresh and support our local agriculture. So that's pretty great. Steve O'Neill Apartments, new normal. We did hybrid and in-person and remote learning. And what we found out, remote programming, is that many of the families would really prefer to do remote rather than have to come downstairs and talk to someone. And so we're going to keep that as part of our regular programming. People will have all different kinds of options, but we've learned to read stories, have literacy night over the Zoom, have family visits. I mean, it's just that's been good. So I know that you all really want to know what else happened about COVID. So as I said, it's the last shall become first. It's the first time in my life. So how it all happened was and Brett, would you want me to stop talking for question and answer?
You're doing great. Keep it going. You got another 15.
Okay, so I'm a scientist, and I actually calculated my first R-naught equation when I was, maybe 1972. So when things started coming around about a new virus, I thought, oh boy, this is something that I need to pay attention to. And then in February, HUD sent out generically or links to generic articles on disease control in shelters. And I thought, well, I should probably read those things. So the first thing of any of it, all 3 steps, they had shelters, encampments, and just the general homeless population. Number 1 was contact your local public health and coordinate with them. So I called up Amy Westbrook. I said, so hey, she's our awesome head of public health in St. Louis County. I said, so Amy, what do we do now? And she gave me a task force of 5 people to help answer that question. Someone in risk safety, someone in health, in a public health educator, a person who knew about mental health, person who knew about contracting, and then just sort of general housing. She knew it was going to cost money all along. So those 5 people and we were able to get together. And we weren't the only ones who had this liaison. She did that with Lifehouse. She did that with Safe Haven. She did it with all of the agencies, because at the early days, remember, what we were all terrified of was a huge and rapid outbreak in the homeless community. And I just have to say, St. Louis County has been brilliant in their response about that. So starting in March, we laid plans to deal with a massive and rapid outbreak at CHUM. We started building the capacity for isolation quarantine and thinking how we could mitigate transmission if we did have an outbreak at CHUM. We figured out with the hospitals how to prioritize our folks for testing. We had little code words, and I had Nick Van Deelen at St. Luke's and Jamie Conniff, 2 physicians who were our go-to person. If we ever got into a gap where someone said, well, we don't think we should test that person, we would call those doctors. They would get that person the test they needed. So we figured out how to do that. We worked out details for what's called a point prevalence testing, which is if you have to test everybody at a giant site. We had that figured out with St. Luke's in early on. In the minute we had a first case at CHUM, we were ready to roll out testing and isolate. And then we've worked out how to get people vaccinated. We've had 3 clinics at CHUM, and about 40 people have received both vaccinations, and another 40 have received one. So we're getting pretty good. I mean, and all the staff who want them have had 2 shots. We were early on in the tiers. And my rule for us was we were never going to jump the line, but the minute we were eligible, we were going to really work it out. And our arrangements with the county included that if they had, when they were in the tier above us, if they had 1 or 2 shots left over, then we would send someone over to get those, because they also realized that we still had a possibility of a disaster in a congregate setting like CHUM. So I don't know what other states did, and I'd love to know, but I don't have time to learn. But Minnesota, within days of the governor's emergency proclamation, well, bipartisan support, $26 million to prevent COVID, or to deal with the COVID response for people experiencing homelessness. That was astonishing. And they did it so simply and so smoothly. The normal state request for proposals is like 100 pages long. This was a 7-question Google Doc, and you just had to fill it out. It was remarkable. And we could apply for funding for shelter, for health and hygiene and staffing. And since that moment, we have everything we've needed to respond to COVID, to protect vulnerable people. We've been able to do. We were able to harden our facilities. CARES funding from the city, county, and the state helped us do that. Install barriers in CHUM shelter to prevent transmission. Remodel the bathrooms and the kitchen. That's still ongoing. Bring in hand washing stations. Double the freezer capacity at the food shelf. Alter the public spaces in the Steve O'Neill apartment so that we could promote social distancing, but still allow people to work together. We needed to acquire zillions of gallons of disinfectant and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of masks and gloves, and public and private support has just made that possible for us. We haven't had to worry about it a bit. It does feel like the last are first. We needed places for isolation and quarantine. The city of Duluth rented the first floor of the downtown Duluth Inn for us to put people from CHUM who were especially vulnerable, so elderly and people with underlying health conditions, so that they wouldn't be, so we would de-densify, I don't know the word, but lower the density in CHUM congregate shelter by removing the most vulnerable and giving them their own rooms. And so the city did that from May until September, and then CDBG, the city gave us money to do it since then. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, I'm working on a purchase agreement right now, so that can be a permanent part of CHUM, that little hotel. That'll be 43 new units of permanent housing for single people, which is the largest group of people who are experiencing homelessness. And I'm delighted about that. And the county has already put in $1 million, and Blue Cross Blue Shield has already put in $100,000, and the HRA has put in $250,000. Greater Minnesota Housing Fund is willing to come with whatever gap we have behind that. And I'm talking with 2 potential end owners or partners, other partners in it, One Roof in St. Luke's, about how we could make this really medical housing as medicine and really take care of the most vulnerable. So that's on the horizon. Meanwhile, the county, using, again, state supports, rented the Radisson Annex for us for isolation quarantine. And so we've had the capacity since early on to have up to 72 people in isolation and quarantine if we needed it to, in case we had an outbreak. So overall, for all of this, CHUM has received $1.6 million through COVID money to do what we needed to do. And $1 million of that we turned into our own economic stimulus by hiring, first off, Congress couldn't do it, but I raised the minimum wage at CHUM to $15, and the board supported that, $15 an hour. And so that happened early on. And I was so happy about that. So that was part of our economic stimulus. Then we did the deal with Duluth Inn, and that's been about $500,000 to keep their people working, their vendors working, their kitchen going. Sometimes early on, we were 50% of their business. So and as I said, that turned out to be a beautiful thing. Another $500,000 went in. We hired 20 people who'd been laid off at their regular jobs to provide 24/7 at the Radisson Hotel if we had people, or Radisson Annex, if we had people in isolation and quarantine. That bridged a lot of people, and they're still working for us. They came from all over. Like some of them were like pharmacy students and who had lost other parts of their job. Everyone, it's just an amazing, diverse group of good-hearted people who were willing to take what was pretty an unknown and potentially quite dangerous uh, job. So so that was the $1 million, $600,000. A lot of it went into the Capitol building at CHUM. I told you about the rebuilding of downstairs, the remodeling of doubling the capacity at the food shelf for freezers, renting the Duluth Inn for 6 months, so people could have a place to live. So it's again, buying the health and hygiene stuff that we needed. So it's just been really great. And so what actually happened at CHUM and COVID is the best thing is that the fear of the outbreak didn't happen. I mean, the outbreak didn't happen. There's no disparity in how COVID hit CHUM as it hit the entire community. Over time, we've had 224 people who've had to be in isolation or quarantine, but only 57 of them were actually positive cases. And of those, only 33 came from CHUM. The others came from all over the place. When we set it up, we thought it was protecting CHUM, but pretty quickly it became clear that we were responsible for the COVID response for all of southern St. Louis County. And now we're responsible for anybody throughout St. Louis County who's experiencing homelessness. We had our first case November 16th, and I had my case on November 17th, because our rule was as soon as there was a positive case, everybody had to be tested. And so we had our first positive case on the 16th. So everyone ran out to get tested. And I came back positive to my astonishment. I had a very light case. I still almost recovered my sense of taste and smell. But anyhow, and Kim was also positive, but also similar, very negative, very light case. So we've had 57 positive cases, and 49 of them were after mid-November. And so you think about, and I will send this slide, it was like we were ready. And then it kind of a little bump in September, October, or November, a little bump in November. That's when we did the massive testing because we had that positive case in CHUM. We only found 3 other cases. And then we retested everybody and nobody got it. So our actions prevented that from being a huge, huge outbreak. The Department of Health thinks we walk on water because of this, and it's all planning. I mean, it's not just accident. I mean, it's very intentional. And then in December, we had our spike like everybody else, all St. Louis County. And then we dropped down and we had 4 cases in January and 2 in February. And let's see, last Wednesday, for the first time since November 16th, there was nobody in isolation and quarantine at the Radisson. We've worked it out, and so what happens for the people who work there is they go on call, and I pay them for 3 hours a shift, 3 hours a day that they're on call, and then if they come in, then they get the full. So it's not nothing, and I just felt it was not fair to not compensate people if they were ready to come into work at any time if they didn't have to come. So I asked them, I said, what do you think is fair? They said 3 hours. I said, great, you got that, so that's what we did. The interesting thing was the first 8 cases we got, none of them were from CHUM. None of that. They were all from either of the hospitals or another institution like Birch Tree or Bethel or Teen Challenge that had a positive case that didn't want them or could discharge them. And I was like, whoa, this is really serious. So we ended up with people with open heart surgery or in here from Virginia because they had 2 series of surgeries. And instead of sending them home to Virginia, they left them here and that made them homeless. And then we had to take care of them after post-op, and which we can't do because we don't have those skills. And it was kind of a mess sorting it out. But as you know, CHUM is the organization that says yes. So we figured it out. Nobody in the homeless community died of COVID, and only 3 people had serious cases. And they were all in those first 8, that came to us as a consequence of medical conditions, not, and I said to people, there's no way we can take care of people who are COVID positive and who had open heart surgery yesterday, or 3 days ago. So we were able, and then there were some that were sad where there were 3 people who had COVID who were basically evicted by their families who became homeless because of that. And we took them too, until they could move back in with mom and dad or wherever they were, or their husband or their wife and kids. So that was interesting. But I'll tell you, the outcome of this is that we have such deep relationships now with Essentia, St. Luke's, the Lake Superior Community Health Center, and St. Louis County Public Health, that this pandemic will help us so far into the future to deal with health inequity in our community, because people get it now. And the other thing that's happened statewide is that the Department of Health now is one of the biggest housing advocates there ever was. They used to sit out, and not really weigh in on that, even though they'd say, oh, well, yeah, housing is a social determinant of health, and how it is. And so now we have a whole new set of allies in the health field that never really realized it before. And if you look at that, here's a great statistic for you. If you look at that $1.6 million that CHUM got for COVID, and we had 224 people in isolation or quarantine, we could have had, for that much money, we could have put all of them in a 1-bedroom apartment in Duluth for a year if we'd had the apartments available. So that is actually stunning. And that's the cost of homelessness. So I want you to know that you can count on us to stay true. CHUM will stay true to all of this. We'll respond. We'll take every step we can to build our capacity for response on any of these areas. Anything that happens to put the needs of our guests who come to us for assistance first. And we can't do it without you, and we do it in your name. So a couple things that are what's next. And I told you about the Duluth Inn, and I think that's poor folks. They asked for 4.5. They wanted to sell it for $4.5 million. And I said, that's ridiculous. But if you want to donate half of it and call that price, but donate half of it, I'll buy it for 2.5, and you can write the other half off if you want. Well, I wouldn't do that. So guess what our ending price is? It's like 2.65 million. So they lost the opportunity to do that. But they've been great to work with, and we hope within 60 to 90 days that'll be in Duluth and be able to convert to housing. And we are able to do that through housing supports and all kinds of things. I'm very excited about it. And I've told the board that I will stay at CHUM. I will help make that happen. I won't dump that, the last 10 seconds of that operation on a brand new executive director. The other thing I'm really excited, I'm going to say the downer that's ahead of us is we actually had more HIV positive in the homeless community in January than we did COVID positive. And this is scaring the heck out of the infectious disease specialists who are on their toes anyhow because of COVID. But to see this spike in HIV positive in the homeless community up from 0 for a long, long time is pretty frightening. And so already we're beginning to switch to have the same conversations that we've had about this new virus, about this old virus. And how do we do education? How do we do treatment? How do we do prevention? And all of the cases were either IV drug users or their partners. And as I said, about over a third of the people who come to CHUM are that. And I'd say half of the people who live at the Steve O'Neill are IV users. And so this is another virus that's rearing its ugly old head, not novel head, old head, that we need to get in front of. I did that, feels like a generation ago. The difference now is the availability of treatment. But as you can imagine, testing and treatment, homelessness is an enormous barrier to treatment in particular, because of need to take, regular meds and be where people are. So that's kind of my new thing. I'm going to figure out how to make sure that we're also in the forefront of that. And the greatest thing I've heard, this is the happiest news, is that we have a friend, an organization in Twin Cities called Beacon Interfaith, which is a lot like CHUM. It has 100 congregations in Minneapolis and St. Paul. It focuses on housing and justice and in a faith perspective. And they have come up with the most wonderful thing called Bring It Home, Minnesota. And I put the link in the chat. But this is a couple of year campaign to provide a Minnesota state housing voucher that's analogous to the federal housing voucher. So no low-income person in Minnesota pays more than 30% of their rent for housing. It's going to take a while to change that ideas in the world of the legislature from 0.5% investment in housing to 4% investment in housing. But this is something that impacts every single county. There's no county in the state of Minnesota where fewer than 20% of the people are rent burdened. Only 1 out of 4 people who qualifies for a housing voucher gets one because they're so scarce. And so if we could figure out how to have the state of Minnesota come in behind it, and it too, I mean, one of the other benefits of COVID is we understand what economic stimulus looks like now. So for St. Louis County, there are 9,500 families who are in this situation right now. And if you do the math out about what the voucher would be, it's about $57 million more coming into the county every year, which is about what the county spends on itself, its own governance thing. But so that 57 million would go into landlords to maybe keep their houses up better. We'd have to put some kind of cap or rent control so that people doesn't just generate rent inflation. So there are lots of devils in the details, but I really love you to look at the Bring It Home Minnesota. It's the first housing response that's at scale that I've had since the 10 years that I've lived in Minnesota. And it's brilliant, and it will work. It will impact every single county. 550,000 people in Minnesota live in households that's like 10% of our population. 10% of our population live under the threat of losing their homes because they can't pay the rent or having to choose rent or eat. And so freeing up, I mean, it'll be a serious investment, but it will also have a serious rate of return. So I'm dreadfully excited about it, and I want you to link on it. And I'd invite the congregation to sign on behind as an organization. And then the other thing, which I've shared in the chat earlier, is Representative Stauber's local aide called me and asked me to call him back about what I thought he should be doing at the federal level. And so what I'm going to do is share that number everywhere I get it. And so you can imagine what I'm going to talk to him about, and I can imagine what you're going to talk to him about. But let's flood this with goodwill and progressive thought. And with that, I'll stop.
That is so much good news, especially at the end, and obviously a lot of challenges too that we're facing, Lee. But thank you so much for the update, and the rest of the floor is open for people's questions to really tease out and explore further details. The only thing that we have in the chat, Lee, is asking a bit more details. I know you spoke about this, but your decision to postpone retirement, and a thank you for all your great work and good energy from Tom.
Thanks. So, yeah, we had the last party at Tom's house before COVID shut us down. I feel like that. Yeah, so it just didn't make sense to. Well, first off, they didn't find someone who come in and for the December, and so I said, fine, put it out later. I will never leave CHUM in the lurch, and I'm not going anywhere. But I think it's time for another head to be at CHUM, and particularly someone who can be at the kind of the forefront of dealing with the change in what we do from a kind of emergency shelter, emergency response to this long-term, how do we get a pathway to treatment? How do we provide a more therapeutic environment? How do we get more people earlier on having the hope that says, yes, diagnosis and treatment is something that I could do, to kind of restore hope. Kim and I want, the phrase Kim used, which I think is so beautiful. She said, I want CHUM to be a portal of hope for people, that a healing and recovery is possible for them.